Joshua, welcome to UXPA Alabama, Lean Product Delivery, Lean UX London, and Let's Meet Up Baku. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, John. Good to see you, and thanks so much for having me.
Brilliant. Delighted to have you. It's the third time we've had you on. It's fantastic to have you back. And this evening is going to be a 1 hour session. Normally we do longer sessions, so probably a punchier style. So what's going to happen is Joshua will do a presentation, might take roughly half an hour. If I see comments, I will flash them up on screen, but in terms of questions, we're going to leave that to the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. So thank you, Joshua. Over to you, Joshua. Thank you so much.
All right. Terrific. Thanks, John. Yeah, as John said, I've got about a half an hour of material I want to share with you folks, and that'll leave us plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So my name is Josh Seiden. I am a designer and an independent consultant. And in addition to that, I've written a few books. I'm going to talk to you today about sort of material in and around my first book with my co-author, Jeff Gothelf. In 2012, we wrote a book called Lean UX. And we're actually in the second edition came out in 2016, I think it was. And we're actually just starting the process of working on the third edition. I'll put in a little plug. We're going to be holding monthly office hours to talk about the writing process and to get your feedback on the book. So look for my Twitter stream to hear announcements for the monthly office hours on Lean UX. Anyway, I've been thinking about the book because obviously we're starting to revise it, and I want to talk to you about some of the ideas in the book. I thought I'd start by just sort of telling you a little bit of a story about kind of where the ideas in Lean UX came from. And then we'll get kind of to the material in the title of the talk, which is talking to your boss about Lean UX. You know, when I first started working in technology, I was working in Silicon Valley in the 90s, kind of pre-internet. And I found this in going through a drawer in my house the other day. This is actually the 3.5-inch floppy disk with one of the first software products I ever worked on. I worked at a company that made mice and trackballs. And in those days, in the early days of personal computers, you didn't automatically get a mouse with your computer. And so if you bought a mouse, we had to send you driver software. And we had a little utility that let you kind of configure what your mouse does. And we'd work on it for months at a time, and then we'd send it to the duplicators, and they'd make thousands of copies, and we'd pack them into boxes and ship them around the world. And I don't know if you can see the screen, but it says version 4.2.2. And, you know, there was, I promise you, a version 2.21 and a 2.3. And every time we updated the software, we had to run new disks and pack them in new boxes and ship them around the world. And if our customers called us, we had to mail them a disk, right? And so the reason I'm telling you this is because this is what software distribution used to be. It had a physical manufacturing step. And this is how, and so we used sort of design and engineering and project management practices that were developed in a world where we had manufacturing, where we were going to design a bridge, build a bridge, or we were going to design a magazine and then send it to the printer to be printed, right? All of those processes that we developed in the traditions of our disciplines, they applied in the early days of software. But this is not how we distribute software today. Right now, we open a web browser, it's connected to the internet, and we're instantly connected to the latest version of our website. Or we go to an app store and we download the latest version of the app. And in many cases, these apps are self-updating, you know? So software is, for all intents and purposes these days, continuous, right? We never stop. Our delivery pipeline has changed, And so our processes can change with that. We have the ability to deliver software continuously. In fact, if you look at some of the more mature organizations in the world that are doing this stuff, an organization like Amazon, in 2012, they stood up at a conference and they announced that Amazon as a whole pushes new software live to production every 11 and a half seconds. Okay. Somewhere in Amazon, somebody is touching off a build, which touches off a bunch of automated processes. This new software gets pushed out live, and they can revert back just as quickly. So this is the new reality of software delivery. And the first people to grapple with this were the engineering community. And that's sort of the thinking that developed around new ways of working here got codified in 2011 by these 17 software dudes who together wrote the Agile Manifesto to talk about this new way of working that they were developing and that we as an industry were developing. And one of the really interesting things about Agile, and I think one of the really interesting things that's important for the work that comes later, is that it sort of changes a lot of the dynamics of a project, and it certainly changes the risk profile of a project. This is a diagram from my friend Janice Frazier, who talks about the way that, with a traditional waterfall project, you start with a set of assumptions at the beginning of the project, and then you build until you get to this release point, right? And then you discover whether those assumptions were right or wrong. And so what you've done is you've built an inventory of untested and risky decisions as you've gone forward. Whereas with iterative methods like Agile, because you are releasing constantly, you're always getting feedback on your work. You're always testing your assumptions. And so while you have these little spikes of risk, you're never building up this huge backlog, this huge inventory of untested assumptions, and thus building up this kind of inventory of risk. Okay. And so there are a lot of methods that use these kinds of iterative processes, and Lean UX is one of them. And so I want to talk to you a little bit now about just kind of, many of you probably heard of Lean UX and have some familiarity with it. Some of you may even be practicing it in your work. But I want to just kind of go back to basics here and talk about what Lean UX is and where it comes from. I was first exposed to the ideas a little more than a decade ago when a colleague of mine, a woman named Lane Goldstone, organized a series of summits between Agile practitioners and designers. And her premise was, look, Agile people are trying to do the same thing that designers are trying to do, that UX people are trying to do. We're trying to create high quality software products that satisfy customer needs. But when we try to work together, it feels like a gang war, right? It feels like everybody hates each other. Why is that? Why is it so hard for Agile people and designers to collaborate? And so Lane put together a series of meetups called the Agile UX Summit. We started to meet in these meetups, and we invited Agile people and designers. And what we started to realize was it wasn't just about engineering and design. It was really about the whole team. How could we bring all of the capabilities that it takes to create technology products? How could we bring them together? And around this time, one of the people who started coming to this meetup was a woman named Janice Frazier, whose diagram you saw earlier. And Janice had been very influenced by the Lean Startup movement. Now, Lean Startup, popularized by Eric Ries in his book called The Lean Startup, and the ideas of Steve Blank, both of them Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, essentially, who were using what were essentially agile methods to design and test business ideas, right? So these were the business people coming to the table with an agile movement of their own. And so what we realized as we started to sit together was that there was this kind of intersection of these practices. And Janice was calling it, Janice said, hey, look, this thing that we're talking about, I call that lean UX. And we had about 30 people in the room that day. And all of us kind of looked around at each other and went, whoa, yeah. And that sort of gave name to this set of emerging methods for doing this work together in an agile context. And so in the book, what is Lean UX? In the book, we say that Lean UX is the practice of bringing the true nature of a product to light faster in a collaborative, cross-functional way. Traditionally, design work is all about creating deliverables, creating wireframes, creating reports, creating analyses, right? And this, Lean UX is about shifting that focus from making deliverables to making the product more directly. And so to do that, we de-emphasize deliverables and we work more on creating a shared understanding across the team and with our stakeholders of who the customer is and what they need and what solution we're trying to build. Because all of this happens in an environment of complexity, right? Software products are complex, and it's very difficult to predict what will work. Lean UX places a really strong emphasis on learning, right? Continuous research is built into Lean UX. It's an iterative process where we learn our way forward. Now, I'm not going to say too much more about kind of the fundamentals of Lean UX, except that there are some key ideas here that I'm just going to name check. If you want to go deeper on that, we can talk about these things during the QA, or we can, you can obviously look at the book where we go into this in a great deal of detail. The first really important idea, I think, is this notion of hypotheses over requirements, right? Instead of saying the product must have this feature, we say we believe the process should have this feature. And we need to figure out if we're right or not. And so our work is to develop the idea about this feature and to test it. And we test that with a nod towards the second point here. We test that because we have a bias towards making. We make stuff to see if it works. And we do this continuously. As I said, continuous learning is built into the process. We're we put a lot of attention on this notion of permission to fail, right? We don't build, the whole point of Lean UX is to take risk out of the system. And so we're not looking to take crazy risks, build stuff and push it out there. We're looking to learn in a safe way. And so that means creating experiments that are learning oriented and also safe to fail. So if we learn that something doesn't work, no one dies. We do this in the context of small cross-functional teams, right? So business people, technology people, design people, content people, all working together, right? In a small cross-functional team. And ultimately, we measure our success not by how much stuff we make or how quickly we make that stuff, but what outcomes we achieve through the delivery of our product, right? Are we achieving the results that our customers want and that our sponsoring organizations, our businesses want, right? So ultimately, we're focused on outcomes, not output. So that was the lightning fast version of Lean UX. Where does it come from and what is it? I want to kind of push on. We had an interesting experience after we published Lean UX, and I want to talk about that in the next section of this talk, which is talking to your boss about Lean UX. After we wrote the book and people started reading it, one of I think the single most prominent bit of feedback we got was from designers and technology teams who read the book and who said to us, look, we really like this way of working. And we want to do this, and we want to do more of it, but our boss won't let us do it. Or our organization is not set up in such a way as to let us work this way. And when we started to dig into that feedback, we heard a number of patterns within that feedback, and I want to talk to you about some of those. The longer version of this talk has about 8 of them. I'm gonna hit the kind of top 4, and we can talk about some of the others in QA. I will say that the other, yeah, let's just get into it. So with that, here's some of the kind of most important things that the objections from the boss. Okay, objection number 1: just make me an app. Okay, right. Most software projects start with some kind of output focus, right? We need a new feature. We need a new page on our website. We need a new website. We need a new app. And it's very difficult then when Lean UX says, look, we're going to try and figure out what the right thing to do is. If leadership is fixated on getting their app, right, you come to a conflict. We did a project. I did a project shortly after the book was published. I worked for a major financial services, consumer financial services company, who came to us. One of the innovation teams hired us, and they said, look, we're trying out different agencies that we'd like to work with. I was running an agency in New York at the time with some partners, and they said, we're trying out different agencies, and we're giving them all the same brief. We want you to remake this web page for us, and we want to see who does the best job, and we'll go forward with that agency. And when we looked at the brief, we said, look, this doesn't make any sense. Why do you want to redo this web page? And they said, well, it's not getting the business result that we seek. We're trying to talk to this group of customers, and the page doesn't seem to be working. And we said, well, maybe there's a better way to get the result that you're seeking. And maybe it shouldn't be a web page. Maybe it should be, one of a number of different possible things. And in fact, they said, oh, you know what? We have a list of ideas that we've thought of, and these are all the programs we're going to do in the next year. And it's about a dozen ideas. And we said, well, why don't we test these ideas and see if they're any good? And we did. We worked our way through a dozen ideas that they intended to fund, and apps and programs and things like that. And none of them worked. Right? We tested them. These were ideas that had been, you've got ideas in your organization that have been hanging around for a long time. These were ideas that had been hanging around and had gotten budget and that they were going to do, but none of them worked. And the people we were working with were thrilled. They said, my God, in just a few weeks, we tested all of these ideas. You saved us so much money because now we don't have to build these things. And you saved us so much time because you tested them so quickly. Isn't this great? Let's go present it to the head of innovation. And so we did. We presented it to the head of innovation. And at the end of the presentation, he looked at us and he said, I gave you money for an engagement to build an app. I don't see an app. And so, he was completely unhappy with the results of that project, even though the people we were working with saw the value there. And so this is one of the big objections, right? That very often it's the case that there's some promise made at somewhere in the organization. This head of innovation had gotten money, and he was going to demonstrate the success of the money that he'd gotten by showing everyone the app that he had promised. And then the people working for him didn't deliver him an app, and he was caught out cold. So in those situations, it's really, really important when your boss says, just make me an app, to understand, what is your boss working for? What has your boss promised? And how do we make sure that we are both redirecting towards something that's good for the business and setting the boss up for success? Okay. Now, another objection that the next objection that we heard frequently, and you've probably heard this if you do any kind of user experience work, we don't need to talk to customers, right? I'm a genius. I'm going to tell you what to build. In fact, some years ago, I was working at one of the major newspaper and magazine publishing companies in New York City. And we were working on a relaunch of a successful magazine. They brought in a new executive editor for this magazine. And we were helping with the redesign of the magazine's website. And in talking to the editor, I said to him, I was curious, like how they were going to measure success. And I said to him, how do you know what your readers want? Do you ever talk to your readers? And he was so offended by that story. He looked at me and he said, what do you mean, how do I know what my readers want? That's my job. And what I came to understand is that for his entire career, he had been hired and promoted and looked at for his judgment and his taste and his kind of innate sense of what the market was looking for. And that the idea of talking to, when I suggested that he might talk to customers, I was insulting the thing that he'd built his reputation on, which was how well he knew his readers, and how well he could represent their point of view. And so when your boss says, listen, we know best, right? What your boss says is, what your boss means is, don't challenge my judgment, right? Now, we all know how badly that works in building software. In fact, there's been a great deal of research about that. I would suggest looking at a terrific article by Jared Spool. You can Google it, on exposure hours, that shows that the most effective teams making digital products are the ones that have the most, what he calls exposure hours, which are hours spent in direct contact with their users and their customers. So we know that that's the right approach. And the challenge here, whether it's lean UX or any UX approach, is to work with your genius boss to help him or her understand this new approach. Okay. Now, this is another one that we hear frequently. This idea that well, we can't do that. That crazy lean stuff. That might be fine in an unregulated industry, but we work in a regulated industry, and we can't put our customers at risk. We can't play that game. I'll tell you, I worked just a few years ago with one of the big U.S. banks with a team of coaches, and we were working to help that whole organization become more agile. And so one of my colleagues was working with a product innovation team. I was working with the legal team. And one day my colleague came back to me very, very excited. And he said, I want to tell you about Project Phoenix. That was probably not the real code name. He said, Project Phoenix, those guys are doing the most incredible work innovating in e-commerce. It's really incredible. And I can't tell you what they were working on, but it really was, they were really doing fascinating work. They were coming up with really great innovative ideas. And they were really using these lean UX methods, talking to customers and building MVPs. I mentioned that to the legal team, and they said, oh, no, not Project Phoenix. Project Phoenix, we discovered last week, they're breaking the law, and we had to shut them down. And it turned out that what had happened was this Project Phoenix had talked to legal, 3 months ago, had gotten a blessing, and had gone off and just run with that blessing. They never came back and talked to each other. It turns out that in the initial conversation, both sides misunderstood what the other side was worried about. And so the blessing wasn't such a good blessing. And then they went off and they got themselves in real trouble. And so what we realized was that we needed to change the way the innovation teams and the legal teams work together. And so we began setting up a regular weekly meeting between legal and the innovation teams. And we also arranged for the lawyers responsible for these teams to actually spend some time just sitting and working in their space, like not formally meeting with them, but they just take their laptops over there a couple mornings a week and just kind of sit and listen. And what started to happen was, instead of these teams approaching legal for a blessing and turning into kind of a stoplight, green light, stoplight relationship, it became a real collaboration in which the innovation team and the legal team sort of became one team and were able to problem solve together. So when we talk about cross-functional collaboration, that's really what we mean, right? It's not just about engineering and design. It's about all of the people who work in your organization really working together continuously to make sure that you are taking advantage of all that intellectual horsepower in your organization. Last one I want to talk about is this notion of safety critical industries, right? Sometimes you'll work with some organizations will tell you, no, listen, that's cool for startups, right? That's fine for the Spotifys of the world, where it's just about making playlists. But I was once in a room of power plant engineers, and this guy leans back in his chair and he looks at me and he goes, you know, I designed the control interfaces for nuclear power plants. And, you know, that's different. Okay. And so first thing to say is not every project is a candidate for UX. I'm not trying to say that lean UX is going to solve all of your problems. But what I am going to tell you is that in safety critical industries, testing your ideas is even more important. It's just that the ways that we test our ideas are different from the way a consumer software product would test our ideas. If you look, all you have to do is look at sort of the self-driving car world, right? Those folks are testing their ideas in the real world, but they're doing so in a way that's very different from the way an Amazon or a Spotify tests their ideas, right? So it's possible to do it, but this is where the creativity comes to bear. I said that this was the last one. I want to tell you one more, which is that sometimes you hear, although less these days, sometimes you hear the objection that, hey, this way of working is just a fad. It's going to go away. We know how to build technology products. I'm going to tell you, this is not a fad. Agile methods are with us to stay. They are the appropriate methods to the construction of software. And so Agile design, Agile project management, Agile product management, Agile legal, this is going to be the story of the software era. It's not going anywhere. Now, there's some objections that I didn't have time to talk about. We didn't talk about, sometimes you hear bosses say, hey, we're too big for this, or this will hurt our brand, or procurement won't let us work this way, okay? We can talk about all that stuff in the QA. So my message to you is have the courage of your convictions. It's time to talk to your boss and help your boss understand the new reality, right? That it is actually time for new rules. And these new rules need to reflect the new medium in which we're all working. It's a continuous medium. And so we need to select methods and organize our systems of work in a way that embraces continuous change. We need to organize around outcomes, right? Our goal here is not to ship features. Our goal is to create good outcomes. And this is the way to do it, by understanding what the outcomes are that our organization and our system and our customers seek, by listening to our customers, and then iterating until we get it right. That is the end of my whirlwind presentation. And I think we have about a half hour left for Q&A. And so I'm happy to take questions and discussion.
It's my fault. I was talking to you and I was on mute.
There we go.
Yeah. So I'll go back actually because I thought I was talking to everybody. Apologies. So Andre says hi. Thank you, Andre. Daniel Dwaran says, does Lean UX use time boxing like Scrum or target scope like XP?
So Lean UX is somewhat agnostic to the underlying Agile methodologies. It's designed to be a set of lightweight methods that can be used in lots of different contexts. It tends to focus less on scope, though, and so in other words, less on output and much more on outcomes. So we tend to use numerous iterations to try to move to either learn something, to test an assumption, to validate an assumption, or to create an outcome. So it's more oriented towards time box slices than to scope, but it's somewhat agnostic of the underlying method.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for that question. So Rudiger, regular on the show as well. How do you compare design sprint and Lean UX?
Yeah. So by design sprint, Rudiger, I assume that you're talking about the method that Jake Knapp and his colleagues wrote about in their book, Design Sprint. Design Sprint is a 5-day exercise to it's like a collaborative, focused team exercise to design and validate a product idea. And they're actually very, very compatible methods. We talk about in Lean UX that there's a whole set of kind of team and collaborative design activities that are kind of at the heart of Lean UX. And design sprint is one of the methods that works really, really well in the context of Lean UX. In fact, we were just on the phone or on a Zoom call with Jake and to talk about that for the next edition of the book, and we're going to include some material about how they what that interface looks like in the next edition.
Thank you for that. And so on to the next one. Thank you, Rudiger. Andre, what is the right approach to establish safe-to-fail environment? How to ask the boss for that and receive positive decision?
Yeah, that's a really big area, and it has a couple of I would say a couple of important dimensions. So one dimension has to do with the way you design your experiment, right? You want to design your experiment in a way that nothing gets damaged if the experiment doesn't work, right? So and that is really, really context dependent. So the way Amazon might test a new layout of their shopping cart is very, very different from the way a startup might test pricing is very different from the way a medical device company might test the software parameter setting in their app, right? And so there's no one right way. The thing to understand is that it's important to be contextual, to understand the harm that your experiment might cause, and then design an experiment that doesn't cause that harm. So that's the first thing, and that's almost like a technical practice. It's like, how do I design my test? But then the other piece of it is the kind of organizational dynamics, which for example, a team that's measured on velocity, right, is measured on how many stories they finish, how many features they pump out the door, right? Well, what happens to velocity when you're doing tests, right? When your focus is on learning and research, inevitably velocity is going to go down unless you redefine the way velocity gets calculated, right? And so is that safe for a team? Is the team compensated or measured on their velocity number? That's a conversation you need to have with your boss. And so that goes to the design of the organization and the incentives. And then I think maybe the last mention is this notion of psychological safety, which is it safe for the team to say, hey, we really are not clear about the right way forward, and we want to do research and learn, right? Will that feel like something that the team is rewarded for, or will that feel like a challenge to the boss's authority? And will that be an unwelcome conversation? So I think those are the dimensions, right? It's sort of like, what's the technical design of the experiment is a component of it. The kind of structure of the team and how they're measured, and then the last is sort of that psychological safety. And I don't think there's not like a magic wand and you can just kind of hit it with a safe to fail stick, but it really is about moving in that direction. And I think the way to start is always to start by saying, try and find common ground with the boss, whoever that is, and saying, look, we think that it would be risky to approach this bit of work, whatever that bit of work is. We think it would be risky to approach it in the normal way. And what we want to do is we want to run an experiment that will reduce the risk. And can you give us permission to run that experiment and reduce the risk there? And by starting with something that's, you and leadership agree is high risk, right? And getting that buy-in that this is a right place to pilot this approach, right? You can start to incorporate this approach into the work, right? Starting with a high risk, a context that may be relatively high risk, and then expanding once that pilot yields good results.
Thank you, Joshua. One more question from the comments, and then we're going to two people from Alabama, Robin Potts and Joy Robinson, to get some live questions on camera. So this one is from Afroz and Basharati. What should we do if the hippo asks a requirement that is defined while taking a shower?
Yeah.
Based situation.
I have a colleague who used to say there were scientific breakthroughs, what he called the 3 B's of scientific breakthrough. They all happen in the bed, in the bath, or on the bus, right? Like, these are the moments where we like, and we have some great moment. It's like, I know, teleportation, team, go work on it, and so that happens all the time. And I think that's sort of that thing of like, oh, we don't talk to customers, right? I know better because I'm the boss, I'm the hippo, whatever. And so, one way to have that conversation, and that, again, a lot of this is sort of relationship based. Like, what's your relationship with that hippo? Can you sit down and have a frank conversation with him or her, or do you have to kind of massage the ego a little bit? But it really is to talk about what success looks like, right? Like, when we build the thing you envisioned in the shower, what will that do for the business? And what are the risks? Like, can I have a frank conversation with leadership about the risks? And do you think we should test these risks first? How can we test these risks first? Sometimes it's better to ask forgiveness than permission, right? And that depends on the relationship. But I think, I have a colleague that I worked with. She works in innovation, and she was working for a particularly stubborn client who had a particularly strong shower vision, and she just had such an easy time kind of managing his ego. And I said to her, like, how do you do this? And she said, well, fundamentally, I love the idea too. And she said, it's just like when you're babysitting, if you love the child, the parents will love you. And so she said, I love the idea. I'm not sure it's going to work, but I love it. And he understands my enthusiasm for the idea and understands that I'm a supporter of the idea, but I'm the one who's responsible for making it happen. And I think if you can approach it that way as an ally of the hippo, as opposed to the person who's like, I'm the person who's going to prove you're an idiot, you're going to have a lot better luck.
That sounds like really sage advice. Thank you so much for that one. Great
Yeah.
question. So we're going to bring on Robin Potts now and Joy Robinson from Alabama. I did a lot of UX work with both Robin and Joy. And thank you so much.
Hey, folks.
And Robin's going to start with a question for you, Joshua, and then Joy will have a question after that, straight after that.
Great.
So can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Oh, good. So one of the questions, and I know this comes up quite often in the companies that I have done user experience for, is the choice of whether to hire UX professionals who already know what they're doing and insert them into these cross-collaborative teams versus teaching those UX skills to the existing team members already. Do you have a recommendation on pitfalls or bonuses for both of those, or prefer one over the other?
Yeah.
I mean, as a UX professional, of course, I'd rather them hire more of us, but that's not always possible.
Yeah, and it's not always possible because you don't always have the budget for it, right? Like a lot of times, the organization doesn't carve out. In my opinion, every team that does something that's user facing should have a user experience person or more on it. That's my bias showing, but that's what I believe. But that's not always possible, as you say, Robin. I think that the best way to learn a skill is to do it, and to do it under the guidance of an experienced professional, right? So, for example, it's 2020, so I'm an amateur baker, right? And so I bake bread at home, and I am such a slow learner, and I frequently wish that I had an experienced set of hands next to me in the kitchen saying this is what you need to do right now, right? I could learn that, but I don't have that person. And so my learning curve is just, ask my wife, it's agonizingly slow. But so I think that there's a strong case to be made for bringing in experienced people, but I think you have to bring in the right kind of people, because I think in the old world of design, there was sort of this notion of well, we're the specialists. We're going to tell you how to. We're going to do it. And we're going to tell you how it is. Right. And I think the new world is increasingly looking more like designers as facilitators and trainers and teachers. Mm-hmm. And I think that those are the kinds of people that I would be looking to bring into an organization in the short term to help my people, my internal people, learn skills and learn from people who can mentor others, who are collaborative and facilitative. And so I believe that a lot of user experience work can be done by the digital professional that's sort of generalist, and that there are some specialist things that need to get done. But the way the generalist learns is kind of through apprenticeship.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Robin.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Robin. Joy.
Earlier, you talked a little bit about user exposure hours. I think you referenced Jared Spool, and you talked about one way to possibly measure how well your user experience might be at the end of a project was to measure your user exposure hours. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and expand on what kind of activities might count? So, for example, we don't have a lot of opportunity to say do field visits, but with something like, especially in light of COVID, with like usability testing work, like we're doing a lot of remote activities, remote usability testing, and just sort of contacts with users on the phone. Would some of those activities count?
Yeah, so I think what the way Jared describes it in that article is that exposure hours are the time spent in the direct presence of your end users, and it's presence by the members of your team, right? So it's not just like, oh, we sent a researcher out to be with the customers, but actually everybody on the team was exposed to that visit. I think that remote research counts. I think that, so in other words, I don't think it has to be like I went to that person's office and I watched him or her work. I think that, Zoom calls and video calls, my guess is that would count. I think what it is it's really trying to expose people on the team to direct, unfiltered feedback from the end user, right? So it's not that I, Josh, go out there and I have some experience and I draw some conclusions and I come back and I tell you, Joy, this is what I think, right? Now you're having a filtered experience. It's that you and I would go out there together, right? And we would have this experience together, and we could come back and process it together as a team. I can. I'm not sure how to share the link over this connection.
I can do it if you just in the private chat window. If you just ping it to me, I'll put it up for you, Josh.
Okay, thanks, John.
Yeah,
okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Joy, are you happy with that?
Yep, thanks.
Thank you so much for coming on, and I'm going to continue. And thank you, Robin, as well. I'm going to remove you from the stream for now. We might bring it back in later on, depending on how the comments go. We've got 9 minutes to go. Let's see. Thank you so much for coming on. Okay, so we're going to continue with some of the comments. So Matteo DeVito, I often hear that the lean approach may be suited for startups, but not for established organizations, because a corporation cannot afford to experiment. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a corporation can't afford to not experiment. I think experimenting is harder to do in large organizations. There's no question that there's more organizational pressure to just execute. And generally speaking, large organizations are organizations that have found a working model and are optimized to execute, right? They're very, very good at execution, at doing the same thing over and over again in an efficient way and at scale. And so large organizations tend to be oriented in a way that makes it hard to do experiments. But I think it's actually more important for big organizations to run experiments. You just have to find a way that's appropriate for your organizational scale. And so there are a lot of obstacles to overcome there. Sometimes it's the way your teams are organized, right? Large organizations tend to be siloed, right? So we tend to have an organization that's creating requirements, an organization that's doing design, and an organization that's building it, another organization that's testing it. All of this very anti-agile, and so sometimes that's the organizational problems. Sometimes you have the legal and regulatory and compliance problems that I talked about. But corporations that don't experiment will be disrupted and replaced. So I think they can't afford to not experiment.
Thank you. And I've got the URL as well, articles.uie.com/user_exposure_hours. So I'll put that in the description window as well, and the recording for later on, so you can click on the link from there.
Great, thanks, John.
Thank you. Matthew had a follow-up one. How do you explain iteration when product decisions are dictated by third-party brand or marketing strategies?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, Matteo. The second part of that question, when product decisions are dictated by third-party brand or marketing strategies.
Yeah, me neither. Okay. So maybe if you can come back and clarify, Matthew, I will try to come back to it. And Atika Benham, I think I'm sorry if you're not pronouncing your name properly. How, as a consultant, can we practice Lean UX with our clients who have very limited understanding of Agile and are already quite far along in the delivery life cycle?
Yeah, it's tough. You know, a lot of, as I said in the presentation, lots and lots of engagements, most engagements start with build me an app, build me this feature. It starts with the technology team really being a delivery team, right? It makes the assumption we know the right thing, and your job is just to build it. And so there's kind of two issues here. One is what are the rules of the engagement, literally? Like, what's the contract say? As a consultant, if you've signed a contract, right? If you're like an agency or something, you've signed a contract that says we will give you these deliverables, then you have to give them those deliverables. It's very hard to discover the right thing, because if you discover something new, that's a change order. So part of it is in the way the work is framed, and that has to do with the way the contract is, the project is scoped, the way the contract is written. When I ran an agency in New York last decade, you know, all of the work that we took was time and materials. So to get around that problem of fee for deliverable. If you're on a project though, and it's not really about the contract discussion, one of the ways you can do it is you can have conversations with your stakeholders about where the risky parts of your engagement are. So you say, like, look, we're supposed to deliver this feature. Okay, we'll deliver this feature. But this feature, this one feels risky. Can we take a different approach to this feature? We believe that what we need to do here in order to deliver this is to run some tests and experiments and see what the right way to deliver this is. And so it's all about creating that shared understanding with your clients about what the risks are, right? Where the risks lie, and educating them in terms of that, and then advocating for the appropriate response. No one wants to hear, hey, let's do Lean UX on this project. But everybody wants to hear, hey, let's move forward in a less risky way, right? And so that's the approach I would recommend.
Thank you very much for that, Joshua. And thank you, Atika, for the question. And I'm going to bring Robin and Joy back on for one final question from Robin. And so I'll just remove the branding so we can all see each other perfectly well. Welcome back, Joy. Welcome back, Robin. So final question from Robin.
Okay, so the two organizations that I have worked with have been very large systems that the software development takes a lot of different team members, lots of different teams. So it's a very big system in order to get a product out the door, get the features developed. And through that process, when we have introduced Lean UX, it feels like we're starting to shortcut some of the preliminary requirements, the technical hooks and things that have to be discovered before you can even promote or come up with an outcome to do a hypothesis to test that, just because of all the back end stuff that has to happen. So how lean is too lean? Is it as far as UX? We've seen a lot of things come through where the developers will say, well, this is good enough. Let's put this out, and then we'll come back and visit it and see what kind of response we get from the user or the customer. And unfortunately, a lot of times what happens is we never go back and revisit that because there's so much in the system that needs attention and needs to be worked on.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, so the think the first line in the book is the biggest lie in software is phase 2. And so like it's not iterative if you only do it once. That's the fundamental thing, right? And so like, are we doing short cycles of waterfall, or are we really doing an iterative method? And I think that's the conversation the team needs to have. Like either can work, but let's not kid each other about what we're doing, right? Some things we're just going to build it and we'll come back to it, but maybe not for a few years, right? And some things we're going to do it until we get it right, and then we're going to move on. And I think the team needs to be able to have that conversation honestly, and not through neglect, right? And saying like, "Whoops, we ran out of time," So it's a complicated question, and one that probably takes more than a minute to answer.
That's why I asked it, just to see how you would do.
just to top it off with a cherry, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Robin. We have another question for Matthew, but we don't have any more time, I'm afraid, Matthew. So maybe if you could reach out to Joshua directly, and hopefully he might come back with an answer to you.
Yeah, Matteo, hit me on Twitter, and we'll talk about it on Twitter.
Thank you. Robin and Joy, thank you so much for coming on from Alabama. This is especially for people in Huntsville, Alabama, UXPA over there, but also Lean Product Delivery, Lean London Lean UX as well. Joshua, thank you so much for coming on the show, and really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to be here. Good to see you, Robin, Joy. Thanks, everybody out there.
Thank you. Over and out, everyone. Thank you so much.